Stop bracing yourself. Find your inner anvil. Your body is pressed against the mattress, yet a tight, invisible scaffolding is holding your muscles completely rigid. You are lying perfectly still in the dark, but your jaw is locked. Your shoulders are raised slightly toward your ears, and your breath stays shallow, catching at the top of your chest. It is the specific fatigue of hypervigilance, the exhausting sensation that even though the room is quiet, you must remain on guard duty, waiting for a sudden noise, a piece of bad news, or a crisis to strike. Your mind is running in exhausting loops, scanning the dark horizon of tomorrow, desperately rehearsing how you will defend yourself against the next disruption. Right now, your nervous system feels like a brittle glass shield that has been held up against the world for so long that the slightest vibration might cause it to shatter into dust. Let the unique texture of this evening absorb your active defense. The ambient air carries the metallic, dry scent of cold iron and stone, an unyielding reminder that the structure of the earth beneath you is utterly inert, massive, and entirely indifferent to the frantic demands of the day. Feel the density of the surface supporting your frame, not as a fragile platform that requires your balance, but as a solid bedrock that has no capacity to give way under your weight. The tiny muscle groups around your eyes, the ones that twitch as you scan your thoughts for potential threats, can finally surrender their tension to the darkness. Nothing is required of you now. The watch is over, the environment is secure, and you are safe enough to soften. You are not broken because you cannot easily drop your guard. What you are feeling right now is not failure. It is simply the natural survival response of a mind that has mistaken perpetual bracing for true protection. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, nor will we try to aggressively dismantle the protective wall you have built around your peace. We are not here to judge the part of you that trembles or stays awake out of fear. Instead, we are going to learn how to rest beneath the noise of the struggle, allowing the active, defensive posture of your body to give way to an ancient, immovable density. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight. Consider a surprising paradox that lies at the heart of our deepest suffering. Inner security does not arrive when you finally build a shield strong enough to deflect every single blow of life. It arrives when you discover that your true nature is not a fragile barrier at all, but an unyielding foundation that cannot be structurally altered by any impact. We spend our lives trying to anticipate every strike, trying to dodge every painful word or sudden change, operating under the assumption that we are thin and easily broken. But Buddhist wisdom points toward an entirely different reality. The awareness that witnesses your anxiety is fundamentally indestructible. When you stop identifying with the fragile shield and begin to recognize the durable, unmoving baseline of your pure presence, the fear of being shattered simply evaporates. Maybe you have felt this too, the absolute depletion of living as a sentry who never steps down from the tower. When the horizon seems clear for an hour, you find yourself waiting for the other shoe to drop, unable to enjoy the quiet because your mind treats relaxation as a dangerous vulnerability. We brace ourselves against the future, exhausting our core long before the event even arrives. In a moment, an original story from an ancient stone foundry will show us an entirely different way to receive the impacts of existence, a way that requires no resistance and no armor. Take a slow breath, letting the air sink deep down into the base of your pelvis, far below the nervous chatter of the throat, entering the heavy, silent center of your being. Imagine leaving the frantic, exposed plains of human conflict behind and entering a stark stone foundry built directly against a bare granite cliffside. In this quiet sanctuary, the air is cool, dry, and filled with the scent of unheated ore and cold scale iron. There are no alarms here, no incoming emergencies, and no expectations to meet. There is only the solid thud of heavy tools resting in deep repose, and the immense, unmoving weight of stone walls that have stood unchanged for centuries. You have arrived at a place where your defensive armor is no longer necessary, stepping into an environment that allows you to trade the thin fatigue of vigilance for the dark, dense stability of unyielding iron. Deep inside the stone walls of the cliffside foundry, the air remained remarkably still, undisturbed by the harsh winter gales that swept across the outer mountain plains. Within this cavernous space worked an ancient iron smelter named Toru, a man whose frame was as stocky and unyielding as the low-arching stone furnace he had built with his own hands. Toru was entirely deaf, having spent decades in the presence of roaring flames and heavy metal. Yet he possessed an uncanny ability to read the subtle vibrations of the earth beneath his feet. To his quiet forge came a young man named Ren, an armorer's apprentice from the valley below, whose hands were constantly twitching with a fine, uncontrollable tremor. Ren's mind was perpetually locked in a state of high alarm, haunted by the absolute terror of failing to forge a flawless protective shield for the demanding provincial warlord. He lay awake night after night, his ears straining for the sound of distant hoofbeats, his muscles perpetually braced against the anticipated fury of a master who brooked no imperfection. He had climbed the steep granite tracks to find Toru, driven by a desperate belief that if he could learn the secret technique to make an unbreakable, impenetrable armor, his internal shaking would finally cease. When Ren stepped across the thresholds of the foundry, the cold afternoon light was already draining from the sky, casting long, dark, geometric shadows across the hard earthen floor. He found the old smelter sitting on a low wooden bench near a heap of unlit charcoal, his wide palm resting flat upon the cold surface of a massive black iron anvil that occupied the very center of the room. Ren began to speak in a rush, his voice tight and breathless, detailing his exhausting efforts, his sleepless nights, and his constant vigilance in trying to reinforce his work against every conceivable blow. The old man did not look up to trace the movement of the youth's lips instead. He reached down into a heavy leather bucket at his side and pulled forth a rough, unworked square iron ingot. Toru placed the cold, heavy block of metal directly onto Ren's outstretched palms, forcing the young apprentice to catch its sudden, dead weight. As Ren balanced the ingot, he felt the biting chill of the unheated ore cutting through the skin of his calloused fingers, its surface rough and deeply pitted with patches of dark, oxidized rust. The block was completely raw, crude, and devoid of any elegant design or protective curvature. It offered no shield, no deflection, and no barrier against the world. It was simply an absolute, concentrated density of pure matter, absorbing the coldness of the stone room without altering its shape in the slightest degree. The deaf elder picked up a short, heavy iron mallet from the floor and held it suspended in the air above the ingot, looking directly into Ren's wide, anxious eyes. Without any warning, Toru brought the mallet down with a heavy, deliberate thud onto the surface of the raw metal block. The impact was deadened by the mass of the ingot, producing a low, vibrating hum that traveled directly through Ren's forearms and into the core of his chest. The old man pointed a soot-stained finger at the small indentation left by the strike, then gestured toward Ren's own tense, trembling body. Toru closed his eyes and pressed his palm flat against the anvil, letting his breath drop slow and deep into his abdomen. He looked back at the youth and communicated through a series of heavy, slow gestures that when Ren worked on his armor in the valley, his spirit was acting exactly like a thin, brittle pane of glass. He was trying to construct an artificial defense that could repel every single impact of life. But because the world was full of unpredictable forces, his inner structure was constantly splintering under the mere anticipation of a blow. The elder indicated that the young man was destroying his own health, trying to build a shield that could never be hit, while completely ignoring the indestructible nature of the raw iron that lay dormant within his own core. Ren stood perfectly still in the dimming sanctuary, the heavy, rusted ingot still weighing down his cold hands. A sudden, deep wave of recognition settled into his belly, cutting through the frantic static of his thoughts like a heavy weight falling into deep water. He realized that his entire existence had been a non-stop, exhausting effort to avoid the strike, treating every conversation, every task, and every unknown hour of the future as a hammer that was about to smash his life to pieces. He had believed that if he could just brace his muscles tightly enough, he could absorb the impact before it arrived. But looking at the dark, unmoving block of iron in his hands, he saw the true nature of his exhaustion. He was a tired armorer who had forgotten that the anvil does not need to fight the hammer to survive the forge. In a moment, this silent master will show us how to look past the fear of the impact and find the stillness that remains when the hammering stops. The foundry was growing completely dark now, the cold gray light of the mountain cliffside giving way to the thick, protective shadows of the stone walls. The sharp, metallic tang of the unheated ore lingered in the cool air, grounding Ren's awareness in the present moment, far away from his habitual calculations about the warlord's wrath. Take a slow, deep breath, letting your own shoulders sink down toward the earth, letting your mind rest upon the immense, inert weight of that raw iron block as it settles into the quiet of the night. This old story from the stone foundry is not telling us to stop feeling, nor is it asking us to become cold, frozen, or indifferent to the difficulties that life brings to our door. It is not an invitation to turn your heart into a block of ice, or to pretend that harsh words, sudden losses, or unexpected crises do not bring a genuine sting. It is showing us something much quieter, an internal posture that allows us to inhabit a space of profound resilience, without needing to build an artificial wall against our own experiences. When we look closely at our chronic state of hypervigilance, we begin to realize that our deepest exhaustion does not actually come from the external events themselves. The true suffering, the weight that keeps the muscles locked and the mind running in frantic nighttime loops, was not only in what happened, but in the exact way the mind held what happened after the moment had passed. In our modern emotional life, what we often call attachment is that tight, breathless bracing that assumes we can only be safe if we control every variable around us. It is the silent, internal demand that says, the future must look exactly as I planned, or I will be completely ruined. This frantic craving for absolute certainty operates like a brittle shield, forcing us to meet every changing circumstance with total resistance. When an unexpected disruption occurs, or when the mind merely anticipates a potential problem, the body automatically tenses up, trying to absorb the impact through sheer muscular force. We become like an armorer who spends all his hours trying to reinforce a barrier that is fundamentally fragile, forgetting that the more rigid we make our defenses, the harder we fracture when a heavy blow falls. The ancient insights of Buddhist wisdom help us stop adding a second wound to the first. The first wound is simply the raw impact of reality, the sudden change in plans, the difficult conversation, the natural instability of a life that cannot be completely managed. These are the inevitable mallet strikes that land on the surface of our existence. They are sharp, but they are localized and temporary. The second wound, however, is the one we inflict upon ourselves through our psychological reaction to the strike. It is the secondary spiral of anxiety, where the mind takes a single difficult moment and transforms it into an absolute proof that we are permanently unsafe, permanently flawed, or destined for catastrophe. This continuous bracing against the next imagined blow is what truly depletes our inner resources, leaving the body trapped in a perpetual state of high alarm. When we practice modern mindfulness, we are simply learning how to step back from this defensive scaffolding and occupy a space of pure awareness. This awareness is the quiet, expansive presence that notices your worried thoughts without choosing to become them. It is the capacity to feel the physical sensation of anxiety in your chest and say, there is a tight feeling here, rather than, I am broken and must fix this immediately. By translating this wisdom into our emotional reality, letting go ceases to mean giving up or becoming passive. Instead, letting go means releasing the extra, unnecessary struggle of trying to prevent life from being unpredictable. It is the willingness to let the hammer fall without allowing the vibration to shatter your core identity. Impermanence, when felt deeply within the body, becomes a source of immense comfort rather than a cause for fear. Every crisis, every heavy emotion, and every difficult season has a natural beginning, a middle, and an end. They are passing events, moving through your awareness like storms passing over a massive granite cliffside. A harsh remark or a stressful day cannot permanently alter your fundamental nature unless you grasp onto it, replaying it over and over until it turns into a heavy anchor. Wisdom reminds us that the strike may be loud, but the vibration will naturally diminish and dissolve into the surrounding quiet if we simply stop feeding it with our internal resistance. Compassion, in this light, is the gentle strength that meets your own fear without turning it into a source of shame. It is the willingness to look at the hyper-vigilant sentry inside your mind and recognize that this exhausting pattern is not a failure of character. It is simply a tired, ancient part of your biology that has been working overtime to protect you from being hurt. By meeting this tension with a soft, non-judgmental presence, you allow the psychological heat to cool down, transforming the brittle shield into something far more stable. In a moment, this structural insight will shift from a concept you hear into a physical weight you can truly rest your entire body into. The air within our quiet foundry remains perfectly cool and still, totally unbothered by the heavy concepts we have just explored. The massive iron anvil at the center of the room continues to hold its ground, completely unchanged by the shadows that lengthen across the floor. Take another slow, intentional breath, letting the active tension in your jaw dissolve as we prepare to guide the mind into a much deeper state of physical presence. If it feels right, let your attention sink downward into the physical boundaries of your resting frame. There is no need to create a forced stillness, nor is there any requirement to alter the natural cadence of your breath. Perhaps you can simply observe the dry sensation of the air entering your nostrils, cool and unhurried, and leaving a trace of warmth as it flows back out into the quiet room. With each exhalation, you might allow the heavy bones of your shoulder blades and your pelvis to sink a fraction deeper into the surface beneath you, imagining them turning into thick, dense blocks of iron pressing flat into the bedding. Let the muscles of your neck and lower back surrender the invisible scaffolding they have been holding all day, dropping their guard completely into the dark. As you lie here, you might direct your awareness away from the busy theater of the eyes and throat, letting your focus drift down into the lower abdomen. For so many hours, your energy has been pulled upward and outward, tensing like a thin wire as you scanned your environment for incoming disruptions. Right now, let that airy tension condense, becoming heavy and cold like unheated ore, settling into your center. There is no need to practice this perfectly. Even noticing the subtle rise and fall of your stomach is entirely enough. You do not have to perform this meditation to please anyone. There is no critical audience here, no threat of failure, and no standard you must fulfill to be worthy of this release. In this quiet space, you might notice one specific thought or memory from today that is still trying to hold your mind hostage. Perhaps it is a harsh phrase someone directed toward you, an unexpected piece of data that caused your chest to tighten, or a general feeling that you must stay awake to plan for a worst-case scenario. Do not try to aggressively push this thought away, and do not dive into it to resolve it tonight. Instead, you might imagine taking that specific worry and placing it directly onto the wide, dark face of the massive iron anvil we met at the center of the foundry. Let the cold, immovable density of the anvil hold the weight of that circumstance for you. Watch what happens to that image when you stop trying to build a shield to deflect it. You might notice that as you leave the worry resting on the heavy surface of your imagination, the intense vibration of the thought naturally begins to slow down. The anvil does not dodge the memory, it does not strike back, and it does not fracture. It simply absorbs the impact into its immense dark mass, deadening the signal until the frantic loop of anxiety turns into a low, harmless hum. The need to protect yourself through perpetual mental bracing begins to dissolve, replaced by the simple, quiet reality of being a presence that is far too dense to be shattered by a passing event. If your mind drifts back into its old habits of rehearsal, or if a wave of physical restlessness surfaces, remember that you can return to the heavy sensation of your bones whenever you are ready. There is no pressure to achieve an immediate state of total healing, or to banish your hypervigilance instantly. True resilience does not happen by forcing yourself into a state of artificial numbness. It happens when you realize that your core awareness is already safe enough to let the defensive armor drop into the dark ash. Let each breath feel like the natural cooling down of heated metal, allowing your physical self to become heavy, inert, and completely unresponsive to the chatter of the mind. In a moment, our journey will take us back into the stone-walled foundry, following Ren as he returns to the old smelter after many seasons have passed over the mountain cliffside. The raw iron block we have held in our thoughts will begin to open a doorway into an even deeper, more indestructible form of rest. For now, simply allow yourself to remain right here, unmoving and unreacting, letting each breath sink you an inch deeper into the vast dark safety of the night. Many seasons drifted across the granite cliffside before Ren found his way back to the heavy iron thresholds of the stone foundry. The war in the lowlands had eventually ground to a halt, leaving behind a scarred landscape. Yet the internal battle within Ren's mind had merely shifted its shape. He was no longer forging armor for a warlord, but he still carried a relentless inner sentry that caused him to flinch at every sudden movement or jump at the rattle of a shutter in the night. A deep, persistent exhaustion lived in his joints, born from the non-stop habit of anticipating catastrophic changes, a quiet terror whispering that if he ever truly relaxed his guard, a hidden disaster would catch him completely unprepared and destroy the modest life he was trying to rebuild. When he entered the cavernous workspace, the air was entirely cold and dark, the great clay furnace remaining unlit and silent. Toru was sitting quietly on the dirt floor, surrounded by a heavy layer of dark, powdery charcoal dust that had accumulated over months of inactivity. The old smelter did not move to light a fire. Instead, his wide fingers were tracing the outline of a pair of heavy, unhinged iron tongs that lay resting in a deep bed of cold, gray ash. The tool was massive, primitive, and completely disconnected at the pivot, its two long metal arms lying parallel and inert, incapable of gripping or holding onto anything in their current state. Toru picked up one half of the unhinged tongs and offered its cold, pitted handle to Ren, gesturing for the young man to sit beside him in the dust. As Ren took the metal, the absolute lack of warmth in the iron traveled directly into his palms, the dry, clean smell of ancient soot settling into his senses. The elder then took a small, jagged fragment of broken granite from the floor and placed it between the two separate arms of the tongs. He motioned for Ren to try and lift the stone using the unhinged tool. Ren squeezed the handles tightly, his muscles straining. But because there was no central pin to lock the pieces together, the iron arms simply slid past one another, leaving the stone resting undisturbed in the gray ash. The deaf elder watched the youth's frustrated efforts, then gently took the handles away and laid them flat back down into the dead coals. Toru looked into Ren's face and moved his hands in a slow, downward motion, indicating that when a sudden crisis or a frightening thought entered Ren's mind, his spirit was acting like a pair of frantic tongs trying to grip and manipulate an unpredictable stone. The old man communicated that the mind believes it must seize every worry, hold it tight, and force it into a safe shape to survive. But because the future cannot be gripped by human hands, this constant effort at control only creates a friction that wears down the internal joints until the spirit feels entirely broken. Toru placed his wide palm directly onto the center of the cold, massive anvil, letting his eyes close as he leaned his entire torso against its dark bulk. He opened his eyes and gestured to Ren that the foundry had not become peaceful because the hammer of life had stopped falling. The space was quiet because the anvil had dropped its interest in the sound of the strike. The elder indicated that true transformation does not mean fixing the external world or preventing the unexpected from landing on your surface. It means discovering that your awareness is like the deep bed of cold ash surrounding the tools, completely loose, completely non-reactive, and entirely incapable of being shattered by any blow that falls from above. Ren sat in the deepening shadows, the heavy iron handle resting loose across his knees. A sudden quiet realization blossomed in the center of his chest, slowing the frantic pulse that had been hammering against his ribs for years. He looked at a rising wave of anxious thoughts about his future. But instead of immediately jumping to build a mental shield or manipulate the scenario, he simply paused. He took a slow, heavy breath of the cool, dry air and allowed the uncertainty to exist without trying to touch it. He did not achieve an instantaneous state of perfect, unshakable enlightenment. The familiar tightness of fear was still hovering around his collarbones like a cold draft. But in that exact moment, he stopped treating the fearful thought as an absolute truth that demanded his obedience. He simply let his fingers loosen their grip on the iron tool, letting it slide back down into the quiet cradle of the gray ash, and allowed himself to be exactly as he was, unhinged from the need to control, unmoving and tastefully resting on the solid dirt floor. In a moment, this shift will help us dismantle the deep, hidden machinery that keeps our own bodies locked in a state of high defense. The twilight had completely retreated from the granite cliffside now, leaving the interior of the foundry to be governed by a thick, protective velvet of absolute shadow. The dry, mineral scent of cold charcoal and raw ore remained perfectly suspended in the still air, establishing a heavy boundary around the old furnace. Take a slow, weighted breath, letting the image of those unhinged tools sinking into the dead ash anchor your own physical awareness, letting the frantic urge to manage the future dissolve into the deep, dark safety of the night. When we look beneath the surface of a mind that refuses to sleep, we find a complex hyperactive defense grid that operates entirely on the basis of resistance. We spend our evenings replaying the past, dissecting old conversations, and micro-analyzing the exact tone of a supervisor's voice, operating under the false assumption that if we can just find our mistake, we can prevent it from ever happening again. This continuous rehearsing of the future and hoarding of past outcomes is a direct attempt to manufacture certainty in a world that is fundamentally fluid. The primitive centers of our brain treat an unresolved problem or a vague future event as an immediate physical threat, convincing us that the act of worrying is an active form of protection, completely unaware that this psychological tension is what is structural, weakening our well-being. A particularly exhausting aspect of this internal grid is the unconscious habit of trying to fix our perceived flaws through a process of systemic self-judgment. When we face a difficult social encounter or an unexpected setback, the mind immediately turns its sharp tools inward, using shame to reshape our behavior so we can gain the approval of others. We tell ourselves a heavy, repetitive story about our structural unworthiness, gradually transforming a temporary moment of emotional distress into a permanent identity. We begin to view ourselves as a fundamentally fragile object that must constantly stay on guard, rather than a deep, unyielding presence that is simply witnessing a passing storm of circumstances. This is precisely where the ancient clarity of Buddhist psychology offers an immense relief, dividing our experience into what is known as the first pain and the second pain. The first pain is simply the raw impact that life delivers to our doorstep: the sudden change in financial security, the cold distance of a loved one, or the natural friction of moving through a complex world. These are the inevitable mallet strikes that land on our external surface. We cannot always control when or where these impacts land, just as the massive stone foundry cannot control the cold frost that settles into its granite walls. This initial pain is sharp, but its duration is limited. It is an event that naturally passes if left alone. The true source of our chronic exhaustion, however, is the second pain, which is entirely constructed by the mind's refusal to let the strike land cleanly. The second pain is the massive web of catastrophic thinking, self-blame, and historical mapping we construct around a single difficult event. It is the voice that takes a minor disappointment and turns it into an absolute decree that we are destined to be left behind, unsafe, or permanently broke. We do not have the power to stop the first pain from occasionally touching our lives, but we have the absolute capacity to stop feeding the secondary loop. Every time we notice our mind spinning a frantic theory about tomorrow and choose to drop our attention back into our heavy bones instead, we are depriving the second pain of the fuel it requires to maintain its guard. True peace is never found by designing a life that is entirely devoid of impact, tension, or difficult transitions. It is found by establishing a fundamentally different relationship with that difficulty when it arrives. When you discover that your core awareness is not a fragile barrier that needs to be defended, but an unyielding anvil that can receive any blow without being structurally modified, the need to brace your muscles completely disappears. You begin to realize that a challenging circumstance is not a fatal flaw in your personal design. It is simply a temporary event passing through your space, no more defining than a piece of charcoal dust falling onto a dark earthen floor. You can allow the future to be unpredictable without assuming that your core self is about to be shattered. By identifying this psychological mechanism, your relationship with your own hypervigilance begins to shift from anger to understanding. You can observe the frightened sentry inside your thoughts without choosing to live in its watchtower. This non-judgmental awareness does not need to violently eradicate the fear. The moment you notice the tension without treating it as an absolute truth, its grip over your breathing begins to loosen. You are no longer a brittle pane of glass vibrating. With every passing sound, you are the immense, silent mass of the forge floor, capable of holding both the heat and the cold ash without losing your native density. In a moment, we will bring this unyielding presence directly into the concrete settings of your modern daily life, exploring how to maintain this heavy, non-reactive posture amidst the very triggers that usually disrupt your rest. The dry, dark air within your room remains perfectly balanced, completely indifferent to the conceptual worries that occupied your day. Let your physical frame continue to surrender its remaining weight into this supportive darkness, allowing each rhythmic breath to remind you that your safety is already solid, immovable, and entirely complete right now. This unyielding, dense stability is not an ideal that you must wait to practice until you are sitting perfectly still on a mountaintop or standing inside an isolated stone foundry. True peace is practiced in the very small, ordinary moments that make up the gritty texture of your modern daily life. It is found in that exact second when you are waiting for a critical text message, watching the small screen glow against the darkness of your bedroom, and you feel that familiar, sharp contraction in your belly because the reply is delayed. In that moment, the old habit of your nervous system is to repeatedly wake the device, checking for a superficial reassurance, treating the digital silence as an immediate emergency. Wisdom begins when you notice that frantic impulse. Pause before touching the glass and realize that the delay does not decrease your own internal mass by a single ounce. We live in a culture that constantly demands we act like brittle glass shields, forcing us to maintain an energetic smile even when our interior landscape feels heavy and soot-stained. You might find yourself sitting through an exhausting afternoon meeting, nodding automatically to look cooperative, while a relentless loop of self-criticism plays behind your eyes. We look at a notification. We compare our quiet, unpolished private struggles to the bright, edited trajectories of those around us, and we immediately decide that we are falling hopelessly behind in our goals. The mind creates a false sense of absolute urgency, telling you that if you do not instantly solve your career, your finances, or your relationship dynamics by tomorrow morning, you will be completely ruined. But a profound shift occurs when you discover that not every frantic thought deserves your active obedience, and not every anxious feeling is a command that requires a reaction. When you feel a sudden surge of panic prompting you to double-check an interaction or fix a situation, you can choose to simply sit with the raw heat of the discomfort rather than running to manipulate the outcome. Taking a slow, heavy breath before responding to a difficult email or a challenging remark is a form of immense spiritual discipline. It is a way of demonstrating to your own nervous system that you are no longer a fragile barrier that shatters at every touch. You can care deeply about the individuals in your life without gripping their emotional states so tightly that you fracture your own core. You can support them from a place of solid density, like a massive anvil holding its ground, rather than as a frantic sentry waiting to be knocked over. This also means that you are permitted to drop into an absolute rest tonight without needing to earn it through a day of flawless productivity. Many of us carry a heavy, silent guilt the moment our bodies try to soften, believing that if we are not actively producing, planning, or making ourselves useful to our environment, we are failing. But your fundamental value as a living presence is not a commercial product that fluctuates based on how much work you manage to finish today. You do not have to settle your entire destiny before you are allowed to close your eyes, nor do you need to apologize for seeking a sanctuary from the relentless noise of the world. Rest is not a luxury reserved for those who have achieved perfection. It is the natural, native right of a physical frame that belongs to the heavy bedrock of the earth. Let this unyielding anvil mindset occupy your somatic awareness right now as you lie beneath the blankets. When the memory of a past mistake tries to pull your attention back up into the cold, friction-filled air of overthinking, let the sheer density of your bone structure serve as your anchor, pulling you straight down into the immediate dark. You can acknowledge that the difficult event occurred without allowing it to reshape your core character. By choosing to let the memory sit on your surface without feeding it with secondary arguments, You are gradually retraining your mind to understand that it is safe to step down from guard duty. In a moment, the final echoes of these practical applications will begin to cool down entirely, letting the teaching pass from language into pure, inert sleep. The space surrounding your bed is growing increasingly heavy, the dark air absorbing your presence without a single condition or judgment. You do not need to be a protective shield for anyone tonight. You are simply a massive piece of cold iron resting undisturbed in the deep, dark ash of the forge, completely hidden, completely non-reactive, and absolutely solid in your own quiet night. The structural arguments are beginning to lose their edge now, softening into the dark corners of the room like the cold, gray powder of charcoal settling into a quiet corner after the bellows have stopped. The absolute necessity to understand, the habit of tracking these lessons, and the drive to analyze your progress can all be left behind on the floorboards tonight. Your physical frame is becoming intensely weighted, dropping into the dark mattress with an immense, absolute gravity that cannot be countered by a restless thought. The wide muscles of your lower jaw are entirely relaxed. Your forehead is cold and smooth, and your eyelids are blanketed by a dense, unreacting shade that has no desire to look for danger. Let the internal cadence of your pulse drop into a heavy, rhythmic thump, sinking with the silent density of the stone walls that surround your rest. There is not a single problem left for you to manage tonight. The busy foundry of the daytime has been locked up from the inside. The heat of the forge fire has completely cooled down, and the hands that demanded your attention have withdrawn into the darkness. You do not need to take your history, your name, or your defensive habits under the covers with you. Let yourself slip out of the heavy, rigid armor that you wore to navigate the friction of the world. You are entering a cavernous, dark sanctuary where no strikes are landing, no outcomes are being weighed, and no one is calculating your value. The dense atmosphere holds your skeleton with an absolute unmoving security, treating your weariness not as a vulnerability, but as a silent, necessary return to the bedrock of the earth. Let your awareness sink all the way down into the heavy bones of your pelvis, far beneath the high, airy plains where anxieties are continually rehearsed. Imagine your entire presence as a massive block of uncarved, cold iron, sinking slowly through a deep bed of loose, inert charcoal ash. The winter gales may continue to rattle the outer cliffs, and the frantic world may continue to vibrate on the surface. But down here in the dead coals, there is only a dense, dark, and total silence. You are resting on a foundation that is far too heavy to be moved by the passing echoes of a difficult conversation. With each slow, unhurried exhalation, you are shedding the evolutionary urge to stay on guard duty. Let the heavy darkness of the room wrap around your shoulders, like a protective, cool layer of stone, dampening every residual signal, cradling your tired chest in a permanent stillness. You have permission to abandon the watchtower now. You have permission to let the future remain completely uncertain, to drop the unhinged tools into the hearth, and to simply allow your consciousness to dissolve into the solid density of the night. Gradually, the mind untethers itself from the necessity of defense, sliding out into a deep, vast valley of sleep where no shields need to be held up against the dark. The breathing has turned into a faint automatic hum, a slow and heavy tide moving through a landscape that has forgotten the rhythm of alarm. You are safe here in the hidden dark, completely unreacting and profoundly whole in your own inert mass. And what if the indestructible piece you have been bracing yourself to protect was never an armor you had to forge, but was always the solid, silent anvil that has been holding you steady through every strike? The heavy iron of that realization sinks deep into the marrow of your bones, anchoring you to the dark floor of the present moment with a mass that no passing thought can disturb. In the profound stillness of this late hour, the ancient truth of non-resistance reveals its most comforting secret. The anvil does not survive the forge by fighting back, but by outweighting the blow. We spend our waking hours treating our hearts like fragile barriers that must be meticulously polished and desperately guarded, believing that any critical comment or unexpected change will fracture our core identity. But when you look closely at the nature of pure awareness, you discover that the presence witnessing your life is not a thin shield at all. It is the vast, indestructible foundation that remains completely unaffected by the changing tempers of the world. Let this understanding soften the remaining layers of your posture, allowing the last traces of your physical guard to dissolve into the dense air of the room. When you look back at the friction of the day from this space of profound somatic density, you can see that the urge to brace yourself was never a failure of character. It was simply a natural reaction of a nervous system that temporarily forgot its own depth. You do not need to judge yourself for feeling anxious or for holding your body tight against the world. The deep bedrock of the mountain does not anger at the lightning that strikes its peak. It simply receives the energy, absorbs the charge, and remains entirely immovable in its ancient silent repose. Tonight, you can be that bedrock, letting every future uncertainty and every past regret land on your surface without moving a single grain of your inner sanctuary. With each soft, heavy breath, let your focus descend even deeper into the unreacting weight of your skeleton. Feel the mattress rising to meet you, absorbing the residual vibration of every task, every meeting, and every digital notification from your muscles and your nerves. The modern world demands that we always stay alert, always stay visible, and always remain ready to defend our choices against an invisible jury of peers. But the quiet darkness of this hour offers a completely different invitation, a sacred permission to be completely inert, completely unmapped, and completely unresponsive to pressure. In this deep, cool foundry of your own consciousness, your daily checklist, your social identity, and your worldly ambitions are nothing more than faint, cooling sparks from a fire that has long since gone out. Think of the immense relief that arrives when you realize that you no longer need to manage the future to be safe within your own skin. The tools have been set down, the anvil is silent, and what remains is the pure, unconditioned density of your own presence, breathing quietly in the dark. You can face the unpredictability of tomorrow without needing to build an artificial barrier against it. You can experience the natural impacts of life without assuming they have the power to break your core. You are whole not because your life is perfectly organized, but because your awareness is an expression of the very same silent mass that holds the ancient cliffs and the deep, dark floor of the earth steady through the night. The space around your bed is dense, cool, and protective, forming an absolute boundary between the demands of the daylight and the profound sanctuary of your rest. The thoughts of the afternoon have lost their momentum, turning into weightless flakes of dark ash that are naturally absorbed into the still air of the room. There is nothing left to defend, nothing left to rehearse, and no further calculations to make before the morning light returns to the cliffside. You have returned to the very baseline of your own being, a place of native stability that requires no effort, no presentation, and no justification to inhabit. Let yourself sink completely into the deeper, velvety currents of sleep now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet bedding. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is. The profound baseline of this deep rest continues to expand, settling through the layers of your mind like the cool, quiet shadows that fill the stone corridors of the foundry long after the daylight has vanished. As your body yields completely to the gravity of the bedding, let the realization sink in that your true nature is not something that needs to be constantly manufactured or reinforced by your own effort. We spend our lives running on a treadmill of hyper-vigilance, believing that if we stop organizing, stop worrying, or stop defending ourselves for even a single hour, we will be left completely exposed to the elements. But Buddhist wisdom points us toward a much more stable reality. The unmoving center of your being is already here, completely whole, requiring no armor to survive the changing winds of the world. Consider how the massive granite cliffside outside your room does not brace itself when a winter storm approaches its face. It does not tense its stone fibers. It does not rehearse its defense against the wind. and it does not feel a sense of failure when the cold rain beats against its surface. It simply stands in its native mass, allowing the weather to happen around it, completely confident in its own indestructible density. You, too, can drop that exhausting human habit of constant somatic defense tonight. You can let the complex story of who you are, your deadlines, your financial obligations, and your social standing dissolve into the dark, quiet space of this room. You are allowed to return to the simple, unadorned state of a physical presence that is anchored directly to the bedrock of the earth, breathing in harmony with the vast, silent night. Let this deep release untangle the very final knots of tension that remain hidden within your chest and your jaw. For so long you have treated every frantic thought as if it were an absolute emergency, a loud command that required your immediate attention and your immediate action. But as you sink deeper into this heavy state of relaxation, you can begin to see that those anxious thoughts are nothing more than passing vibrations on the very surface of your awareness. They do not alter the structural quality of the deep space within you, and they have no power to break the solid foundation of your presence unless you reach out to grip them. You can allow the worries about tomorrow to drift across your mind without choosing to act upon them, recognizing that you are the vast, unreacting floor that holds the entire experience without losing its stability. Think of how beautifully quiet your life becomes when you no longer require the world to remain perfectly predictable for you to be at peace. The old habit of checking for reassurance, of mentally rehearsing every potential crisis, is completely useless in this midnight environment. There is no one here to defend against, no outcomes to manipulate, and no expectations to satisfy. You are entirely free to be hidden, to be unmapped, and to let your consciousness sink far beneath the level of analytical language. The teaching has settled completely into the muscle and bone of your body now, transforming from an abstract idea into a heavy physical density that gently draws you closer and closer to the threshold of deep restorative rest. The space around you remains perfectly still, a dark and protective sanctuary that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to let go. The memories of the afternoon have lost their momentum, turning into tiny, weightless specks of dark ash that are naturally absorbed into the still air of the room. There is nothing left to defend, nothing left to rehearse, and no further calculations to make before the morning light returns. You have returned to the very baseline of your own being, a place of native stability that requires no effort, no presentation, and no justification to inhabit. Let yourself slide completely over the edge of wakefulness now, trusting the heavy density of your body, trusting the spacious stillness of your mind, and letting your awareness fade into the vast restorative ocean of an unjudged sleep. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense, dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is. This baseline of unyielding stillness deepens even further, anchoring your awareness to the dark core of the present moment like a heavy stone, settled into the silent floor of a deep mountain valley. As the last remnants of vigilance dissolve into the mattress, a more profound layer of this ancient insight begins to illuminate the darkness of the heart. We spend our days running on the assumption that our life is a fragile, decorative vase that must be constantly shielded from the impacts of the world, believing that if we relax our guard for even an hour, a sudden blow will shatter us into unrecognizable fragments. But when you rest in the unconditioned space of pure presence, you begin to see that you are not the vase at all. You are the immense, durable mass of the mountain itself, which can receive any strike, hold any weight, and witness any storm without losing its native, structural integrity. Let this deep realization filter through the deep tissue layers of your body, softening the small, subconscious muscles that still carry the phantom weight of defense. When you look back at the friction of the waking hours from this space of profound somatic mass, you can see that the habit of bracing was never a failure or a flaw in your design. It was simply the natural reaction of a nervous system that temporarily forgot its own density. You do not need to judge yourself for feeling defensive or for replaying an old mistake in the dark. The anvil does not wage war against the hammer that strikes its face. It simply stands firm, absorbing the impact into its vast, dark core, allowing the vibration to naturally diminish and die away into the quiet of the room. Tonight, you can be that anvil, letting every unpredictable future scenario and every past social bluntness land on your surface without shifting a single stone of your inner sanctuary. With each soft, heavy exhalation, let your focus descend deeper down into the quiet reality of your skeleton. Feel the density of the bed rising to meet your shoulders and your hips, absorbing the final traces of performance from your vocal cords, your eyes, and your chest. The modern world tells us that we must always stay alert, always stay visible, and always remain ready to justify our worth to an invisible audience of critics. But the quiet dark of this hour offers a completely different invitation, a sacred permission to be completely inert, completely unmapped, and completely anonymous in this deep, cool sanctuary of your own consciousness. Your daily anxieties, your public reputation, and your worldly ambitions are nothing more than faint, cooling flakes of ash from a fire that has long since run out of fuel. Think of the infinite relief that arrives when you realize that you no longer need to use other people's minds as a mirror to verify if you are safe. The mirrors have all been put away. The reflections have faded into the shadows, and what remains is the pure, unconditioned light of your own presence, breathing quietly in the dark. You can care for the people in your life without becoming a prisoner to their shifting moods. You can face the unknown tomorrow without requiring the future to be perfectly clear before you allow your heart to rest. You are whole not because you have solved every problem, but because your awareness is an expression of the very same solid mass that holds the ancient cliffs and the deep underbelly of the earth steady through the darkest hours. The darkness around your bed is soft, dense, and protective, establishing an absolute boundary between the demands of the daylight and the profound sanctuary of your rest. The thoughts of the afternoon have lost their momentum, turning into tiny, weightless specks of dust that are naturally carried away by the cool night breeze. There is nothing left to defend, nothing left to rehearse, and no further calculations to make before the morning light returns to the stone foundry. You have returned to the very baseline of your own home, a place of native stability that requires no credentials, no effort, and no justification to inhabit. Let yourself sink completely into the deeper, velvety currents of sleep now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense, dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is. This unexamined completion expands into the quiet spaces of the room like a deep shadow settling over the heavy stone arches of the foundry, absorbing the final remnants of the day's friction into its velvet dark. As you lie perfectly flat against the bedrock of your bed, let the understanding wash over you that true equanimity is not a wall you must build with your own hands, but the space that remains when you stop building walls altogether. We spend our waking hours treating our peace of mind as if it were a fragile property that could be stolen by a difficult encounter or ruined by an unexpected piece of news. But when you rest back into the raw weight of your own existence, you discover that the clear awareness witnessing your life cannot be touched, modified, or diminished by any external circumstance. It is an unyielding sanctuary that requires no maintenance, no active protection, and no validation from the outside world to remain absolutely solid. Consider how the cold iron anvil at the center of the dark forge does not shrink or change its nature when the temperature of the air around it shifts from summer heat to winter frost. It does not look for approval from the tools resting in the ash, nor does it hold on to the echo of the last strike that landed on its surface. It simply occupies its space with an absolute, majestic density, remaining perfectly content to be exactly what it is: heavy, silent, and structurally unbreakable. You too can step into that profound, non-reactive way of being tonight. You can let go of the exhausting psychological demand to be an answer to every problem, a shield against every crisis, or a perfect manager of tomorrow's events. You can allow the future to unfold in its own unpredictable rhythm, recognizing that the deep presence within you is far too dense to be shattered by a passing breeze of circumstance. Let this release travel deep into your bone structure, dissolving the invisible armor that your muscles have held tight for so many hours. For a long time, the mind has operated under the false belief that to relax is to be vulnerable, that if you drop your guard for even a single evening, a sudden disaster will catch you unprepared and ruin your security. But as you sink deeper into this heavy state of relaxation, you can see that this hypervigilance is simply a tired habit of thought, a passing cloud of dust that has no power over the deep mountain of your true nature. You do not have to fight the anxious thoughts or use shame to force your mind into a forced silence. You can simply notice the worry as a small, harmless vibration on your surface, letting it hum itself to rest without choosing to give it your obedience or your energy. Think of how light your spirit becomes when you no longer carry the burden of constant self-assessment, when you can look at your own fatigue and see it not as a failure, but as a tender, natural reminder that it is time to return home to your own center. In this midnight environment, there are no expectations to satisfy, no achievements to display, and no critics waiting to evaluate the quality of your rest. You are entirely permitted to be hidden, to be unmapped, and to let your conscious thoughts dissolve like fine ash falling into a dark, quiet hearth. The wisdom of the Anvil has moved past the level of words now, settling into your chest and your limbs as a heavy, comforting mass that gently pulls you closer and closer to the absolute threshold of deep sleep. The darkness enveloping your frame is vast, cool, and protective, constructing a secure perimeter where your mind can finally stand down from guard duty. The events of the day, the emails left waiting, the small misunderstandings, the persistent worry that you are not doing enough are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into faint, weightless shadows that naturally vanish into the deep quiet of the night. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern social survival. You are simply a silent, heavy presence resting securely on the solid floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly whole in your own quiet dark. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper, velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense, dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is. This deep completion settles into the marrow of your being like the slow, cold cooling of the massive forge stones after the long daylight hours have run their course. As your limbs grow increasingly weighted against the fabric of the bed, let the realization wash over you that you do not need to build a fortress to keep your inner world safe from the unpredictable storms of life. We often spend our lives trying to manufacture a perfect, unyielding shield out of our achievements, our reputation, and our careful plans, constantly terrified that a single unexpected event will penetrate our defenses and shatter our peace. But the profound wisdom of equanimity reminds us that the quiet awareness witnessing this life is not a fragile barrier that can ever be breached. It is the vast, indestructible foundation itself, completely undisturbed by whatever lands upon its surface, holding every impact with an absolute unmoving security. Consider how the massive iron anvil resting in the quiet dark of the forge does not contract or lose its shape when the hammer strikes its face with a heavy thud. It does not try to dodge the blow. It does not argue with the tool that hit it. And it does not retain the frantic vibration once the metal is lifted away. It simply absorbs the raw energy into its immense solid density, returning instantly to its native state of unbothered, quiet mass. Tonight, You can step completely into that unreacting way of being. You can allow the unpredictability of tomorrow to exist without tensing your muscles against it. And you can let the memories of past blunders sit on your surface without choosing to turn them into an indictment of your character. You are far too dense, far too grounded in the bedrock of pure presence to be broken by a passing breeze of circumstance. Let this release filter down through the deep muscle fibers of your back, your shoulders, and your neck, dissolving the invisible scaffolding that has held you in a state of perpetual guard duty. For so long, the mind has operated under the false assumption that hypervigilance is a necessary protection, believing that if you ever truly let go of your worry, a sudden disaster will catch you unprepared. But as you sink deeper into this heavy state of relaxation, you can see that this continuous internal bracing is the very thing that exhausts your spirit. You do not have to force your thoughts to be perfectly silent or use shame to fix your mind's anxious patterns. You can simply notice the worry as a small, harmless hum in the dark air of the room, letting it naturally run out of momentum without giving it your attention or your obedience. Think of how beautifully simple existence becomes when you no longer look to the external world to verify if you are allowed to rest. The old habit of checking for digital reassurance, of replaying a conversation to see if you were approved of, is completely irrelevant in this midnight environment. There is no one here to defend against, no expectations to satisfy, and no critics waiting to evaluate the quality of your stillness. You are entirely permitted to be hidden, to be unmapped, and to let your analytical thoughts dissolve like fine ash drifting down into a quiet hearth. The structural understanding has moved past the level of words now, transforming into a physical weight that gently pulls you closer and closer to the threshold of deep, restorative rest. The space surrounding your bed remains perfectly still, a dark and protective sanctuary that asks for nothing but your complete willingness to soften. The events of the day, the unfinished tasks, the minor anxieties, the persistent feeling that you are falling behind are all losing their sharp boundaries, turning into faint, weightless shadows that naturally vanish into the deep quiet of the night. You are no longer navigating the complex web of modern social survival. You are simply a silent, heavy presence resting securely on the solid floor of the universe, entirely safe, entirely unexamined, and profoundly whole in your own quiet dark. Let yourself slide completely into the deeper, velvety currents of rest now, letting the mind become completely translucent as the body drops its final defenses into the quiet mattress. The breath has become an absolute whisper, a slow and rhythmic tide carrying you far beyond the boundaries of language and concept. Trust the immense, dark gravity that is drawing you downward into a state of total, unbothered stillness. Allow your entire being to dissolve into the warm, unexamined depth of the night, resting profoundly in the silent, self-sustained embrace of a sleep that knows no judgment, holds no expectations, and is already completely perfect just as it is.